Okay, hello everybody. Today I'm here with classical theist, who many of you probably know. He's, I would say, the official theologian of Nick Fuentes. Is that correct? No, he's been around these spheres for a long time. He has put out some really interesting content on figures like Dionysius the Areopagite, who I'm becoming more interested in. And I thought it would be a good idea to talk with him about the church fathers generally. I am not as educated in all of the church fathers as I would like to be. You know, my reading has been more in Neoplatonism, but the more I've gotten into both the Christian tradition and the Platonic tradition, the more I'm seeing that there are huge overlaps and intersections and really interesting convergences. So, not only I think would it be a good idea today to speak with classical theist, but we're actually going to begin a reading of the Church Fathers. Classical theist and I will be streaming together every other Friday beginning August 4th. We may stream that on my channel or potentially on cozy.tv. And everyone is invited to take part in that. You can message me or email me if you want to join in for the actual discussions and readings. We will be reading through the texts themselves live on stream and engaging in real-time commentary. So it should be educative, I think relatively fun. And anyone tuning in to those, of course, is welcome to ask questions and give their own comments. It's kind of a blind spot that I think a lot of people in these spheres have had. The church fathers represent a huge body of works, and how not only how their thought developed internally, but how it interacted with Hellenistic thought surrounding them and other philosophical schools, other influences, is just very complex. And I think it would take multiple people with multiple specialties investigating it to really do it justice. So that's what we're intending on doing. But I guess to start with, classical theist, do you want to introduce yourself? Where can people find your content? What is it all about for you?
Yeah, well, thanks, Aarvoll. Is that how I pronounce it, Aarvoll?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Well, yeah, thanks for having me on here. I do enjoy your content quite a bit. I think you have such a good uh, grasp on articulating metaphysical principles very eloquently. Just got to say that about you. I get a sense of that when I watch your videos.
Thank you.
Um, yeah, as far as what I'm all about, my name, classical theist, is sort of a um, reference to a certain strain of thought within theism that can be kind of sharply distinguished from how a lot of modern apologists deal with the question, like William Lane Craig and others who Brian Davies kind of calls theistic personalists. I think classical theism is a way of approaching God that is more in harmony with the, I would say, more perennial, ancient, medieval approach to discussing the divine. Now, that's not to say that we can lump all of that together because there are very much vast divergencies within ancient medieval thought, obviously. But I think that it's similar enough to sharply distinguish from how God is talked about by a lot of modern intellectuals these days, specifically with an emphasis on divine simplicity, with an emphasis on um, the super essential transcendence of God. You know, so for that reason, I've named myself that because I really am passionate about popularizing that strain of theistic thought. And I find that perfected, not perfected, but maybe we could say most refined in the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. So that's sort of my school of thinking is Thomism, and I'm also a Catholic, so I also have meant that in with uh, defending the faith, defending Christianity, defending Catholicism in particular, with the help of delving into this rich intellectual philosophical tradition. Uh, and I've got to say, I appreciate um, the contributions that the Platonists have made in that endeavor. I actually consider St. Thomas more of a Neoplatonist than an Aristotelian. So maybe that's a conversation we could have in the future. But that's kind of what I'm about in a nutshell. And you can find me on Twitter. I do have a Cozy channel, cozy.tv/classicaltheist. I have a Telegram, t.me/classicaltheist as well. So, I'm sure most people watching have kind of seen me and interact online and know where to find me.
Yeah, awesome. I think if I was aware of the classical theist tradition when I was younger, I never would have left the church. It was because of that theistic personalist view of God, really, that I couldn't find a rational defense of the faith, and I explored, atheism and then
Same here.
other religions, and came back ultimately to Christianity myself. Now, I wouldn't necessarily call myself strictly a classical theist, but I'm very close to that general position. I think you're right that Thomas Aquinas is better considered a Neoplatonist than an Aristotelian. And I think really, like, from the end of antiquity, when the church assimilated the Platonic academies, they, I think, intentionally promoted Aristotle kind of publicly, but continued reading Plato. Like, church fathers, I think, throughout the medieval period, openly or not, were still influenced by Plato directly and by the Neoplatonic tradition. But yeah, I mean, even the late Neoplatonists tried to make a point of how convergent even Plato and Aristotle were. Today, we tend to think of them in some ways as polar opposites. Aristotle says that the forms are immanent in matter. Plato says they're, in that realm of forms or something like that.
I kind of reject that. I reject that dichotomy. Not fully, but there might be some degree of truth to it. But I think you reject it too.
Yes. Yeah. Thinking Being, a book by Eric Pearl, goes into this and draws this line of continuity all the way back to the pre-Socratics, especially Parmenides, Plato, Aristotle, going down through the Neoplatonists to Thomas Aquinas. And he says basically that, like, authentic Greek philosophical heritage, like the main line of it, is in full continuity all the way up until Thomas Aquinas' Neoplatonism. So, yeah, but that's a big picture overview of, like, one theory of this whole development. But there are a lot of details that I'd like to kind of discuss and see what you think of them. So some of these points of convergence actually go before the time of Christianity proper. Philo of Alexandria famously was influenced by Platonism directly, and other Greek philosophical schools. He actually references Pythagoras more than any other Greek philosopher. But there is a school of thought that actually Plato could fairly be considered a Pythagorean. I've subscribed to that view in the past. I do think that Plato came up with some innovations on Pythagoras. Like, I think the theory of forms in its developed form, like you see in a dialogue like the Parmenides, probably was something that Plato is responsible for. But yeah, so Philo was influenced by Pythagoras, Plato, and he had this concept that the world was created through God's logos. And there, Philo kind of distances the logos a little bit more from God the Father than Christians later would.
Certainly than the St. John, yeah.
Right, exactly. So, and Philo of Alexandria was roughly contemporary with Jesus himself. And, we don't know all the details of the life of Jesus. It's certainly possible that Jesus could have directly interacted with Philo of Alexandria, for all we know.
I wonder about that. I seriously wonder about that sometimes when you read Philo.
So, yeah, what do you think about Philo? I mean, he was discussed by several church fathers. There's an allegation that I just read that actually Ambrose plagiarized Philo. So I can't validate that myself, but clearly this was a continuing strain of thought within the Christian tradition. Have you read Philo at all yourself, or what do you think about his influence?
I have read a bit of Philo. I don't believe it was it him who even went so far as to say, because I know that many church fathers do say this, that Plato himself borrowed. I know Justin Martyr says this for explicitly, for example, borrowed ideas from Moses.
Hmm.
I don't know if Philo makes that claim, but it wouldn't surprise me if he did.
He does. Yeah, a Jewish
Yeah.
thinker, I was just looking into this, Aristobulus of Peneus from the 2nd century BC was the Jewish figure who originated that thought. The Neo-Pythagorean Numenius, some call him actually like the father of Neoplatonism. He was a
Hmm.
Platonist as well as a Pythagorean, but he also echoed that, and he was a Greek thinker. Or actually, he might have been ethnically Syrian, but within the Hellenistic tradition.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So yeah, I think that that's sort of a an interpretive scope through which we should read Philo. That Philo doesn't seem to me to be deliberately trying to uh, baptize. Well, I mean, he's a Jew, so he wouldn't use the word, but for lack of a better word, baptize Judaism into Platonism. He very much sees these as as fundamentally unified by virtue of a common source in Moses. So I think that should kind of help us to get at what Philo was trying to do in his adaptation of Platonism into the Old Testament. And I think it's also worth noting, though, that while many would argue, and I would agree, that his allegorism may go a little bit too far in places, when he tries to harmonize the God of the Old Testament with, again, not only deliberately trying to do this, but when he nevertheless does attempt uh, a synthesis of descriptions of God in the Old Testament with descriptions of the divine that he's picking up from the Platonic tradition, he nevertheless is very much faithful to many citations in the Old Testament itself. Um, Many passages in the Old Testament, thinking of the Psalms, um, they really get at a strong and profound apophaticism about approaching the divine. Um, so I would repudiate anyone who says that the apophaticism that you get from the Platonic tradition is awkwardly um, mended in with Judaic revelation. I don't really like calling it like Judaic revelation because I'm a Christian, but I think you know what I mean. And I think there is a lot in the Old Testament itself that speaks to the super essential transcendence of God, the fact that He is um, very much a hidden God, the theophanies of God point to approaching Him through the darkness, um, through negation, and really getting at his, like I said, his super essential transcendence that the Suda Dionysius will pick up on later. And so I think that while I would not necessarily agree with the characterization that Plato got his ideas from Moses, I think that's historically untenable. Nevertheless, I would say I think there is a profound harmony that can be obtained between the descriptions of God in the Old Testament on the one hand and the Platonic approach to the divine on the other. I think that's a result of providence, uh, but I think it's that harmony that Philo is picking up on and very much contributing to in his own writings.
right. Yeah, I also think it's unlikely that Plato drew directly from the Hebrew tradition. I mean, they were a very marginal group
Hmm.
in those days. Not that Plato didn't have the opportunity potentially to interact with them, but as far as the different kind of priesthoods that would be willing to share their information with outsiders, I don't think that Hebrews of that time would have fallen under that kind of camp.
I just don't see any evidence for it, you know.
Yeah,
There's no like positive historical indication.
no, right. Pythagoras also traveled. I think some of the later Pythagoreans, like after Numenius, mentioned the possibility of Pythagoras interacting with some of the rabbis,
Hmm.
but I don't think any early Pythagorean claims that. I mean, they say that Pythagoras visited the Chaldeans, which could be interpreted as Hebrews. I think Philo himself at one point refers to, interestingly, the Hebrew language as Chaldean. I don't
Hmm.
know exactly what that's about. But yeah, I think it is historically unlikely. Russell Gmerkin has this hypothesis that actually it's the other way around, and the Hebrew Bible took some concepts from Plato. His, and you would probably disagree with this, as I think that would definitely fall into like a heretical position for an Orthodox Catholic to hold.
Well,
But his
I
argument is
think,
that the Septuagint
yeah.
translation
Hmm.
was conducted by Hellenistic Hebrews or Jews, in
Hmm.
Alexandria, where they would have access to the Platonic corpus and other Greek legal writings. And so he has this book, Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible, where he goes through this hypothesis that they were very influenced by specifically Plato's laws, and they actually revised some of their traditional like legal texts and histories in line with Plato's suggestions that he comes up with in the laws. He has some other points that like the nationalistic history literary genre is borrowed from the Hellenistic world. Actually, I think the earliest like manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible are from the Septuagint translation. Like our Greek Hebrew Bible is older than the Hebrew Bible as far as like the documentary evidence is concerned. He says that they incorporate constitutional ideas, and that's not actually in keeping with the legal tradition in the Near East, which, like, if you think of the Code of Hammurabi or whatever, it was much more just like, here are the commandments come down, and yes, there are of course the Ten Commandments, and there's that probably genuine, more ancient legal element, but there's also like more refined legal thought that really does seem derivative from the Greek legal tradition, Gmerkin argues. And I don't know enough about it to judge for myself at present. But what do you think about that possibility that the Septuagint Bible translation actually did develop a lot of new ideas derived from the Hellenistic world, and especially Plato?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't have enough historical expertise to adjudicate that issue. I would say that, as a Catholic, I would say I do very much believe that the deposit of revelation um, that was contained in the scriptures initially was, at least as far as substantial um, teachings and writings are concerned, have been preserved integrally in an integrally pure way. So I would maintain that sort of as a matter of faith there.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't be totally put off by the possibility of some of the uh, some Hellenized uh, assumptions or perceptions making their way into uh, how the scriptural writings ended up being presented in the Septuagint. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's possible.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't say it would amount to any substantial novelties as a result of that, at least as a matter of faith. I mean, like I said, I'm not up to speed on the history there to defend my position uh, from that standpoint. But as a matter of faith, I would say that's about as far as I would be willing to go.
Right. I'm not even sure like what the limits are that the Catholic Church puts down as far as what you can entertain about the origin of the different books of the Old Testament. Like this Catholic Bible that I have that is, officially authorized or whatnot, in many of the footnotes, they make reference to the documentary hypothesis, the Deuteronomist and the Elohimist, the priestly authors, and the idea that these are from different periods of time and they compiled together and revised these texts through history. And so if that was correct, then maybe Gmerkin's concept could be mapped onto like the Deuteronomist potentially. But yeah, can Catholics believe in the documentary hypothesis? Is that, allowed?
I think so long as you maintain that the divine revelation that was given to the sacred author has remained integrally intact. It's kind of immaterial in terms of how that was passed on and developed. I think, but you would have to just maintain that, again, the divine revelation given to the sacred author remained integrally, substantially intact.
Right.
At least as received to, at least as given to, ultimately to the church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's interesting that, Jesus himself seems to be quoting out of the Septuagint translation.
He does.
So, and
absolutely.
Yeah, very, very few Jews at that time knew Hebrew. Paul speaks Hebrew not directly, obviously, in the book of Acts, but it says that he spoke to a crowd of Jews in Hebrew.
Right.
But yeah, it was definitely not like it is today, like an official state language. Most Jews spoke Greek. Jesus spoke Aramaic, most likely. But yeah, I just thought that was interesting, the idea that even the Old Testament itself may, either in its style of presentation or perhaps in its contents to some capacity, be influenced by Plato directly with the laws. And you could even have like an orthodox interpretation of Gmerkin's thesis, which says basically that they took this traditional legal material and put it in the kind of legal theoretical framework that the Greeks developed. And so they weren't like inventing laws, on the spot, or they weren't inventing history, but they integrated their legal narrative and their historical narrative according to Plato's suggestions. All that's perfectly possible, I think. So, yeah, so potentially then you have this working together of the two traditions, even in the 3rd century BC. You have Philo of Alexandria and other Hellenistic Jews who were working with the Greek philosophical traditions. And then there's also like the possibility that Jesus himself was directly influenced, not just by Philo, but potentially by Plato. The idea that Jesus Christ, God incarnate, was ignorant of Platonism is kind of crazy. He created Plato, so he must have known of his philosophy. So what do you think about that possibility that Jesus was aware of philosophical schools at his time? And yeah. So
I would like to preface that whole topic by saying this, that I very much believe that what the wisdom that is articulated in the Platonic schools, I very much believe that that was providentially safeguarded by God to serve as a proto-evangelium of sorts, like a proto-gospel of sorts. Not perfectly preserved as though it's divine revelation, but I do believe that God strongly in his providential wisdom, I can't prove this, but I think it's likely, influenced the Platonic tradition. And of course, Jesus in his hypostatic union with divinity, would have been aware of of the accumulated wisdom from that tradition. And while while he was aware of it, I would say I'm not so sure that you can point to any sayings of Jesus that necessarily reflect an intention on his part to impart Platonic teachings per se.
Right.
I wouldn't say that, but since I do believe that the Platonic schools get philosophically at truths that the sacred authors of the New Testament simply declare, I do think there's a profound harmony there, and that harmony is manifested in many of the sayings of Jesus, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. There are some parallels in the sayings of Jesus with the Platonic dialogues. Like, there was one instance, I don't remember in which dialogue, where Socrates says, a man, if his hand goes bad, is willing to cut off his hand, because it's, the goodness of our body and what it affords us that is relevant, not like our body itself. And there is a saying of Jesus to that effect, right? Like, if your hand offends thee, cast it off.
Mm-hmm.
Or so there are a couple other parallels in the sayings. I should have documented more of them as I was reading both the New Testament and the Platonic dialogues. But that's not the only parallel. There's also, of course, the life of Socrates, where Socrates is kind of an ascetic. He's out dealing with the people constantly, just like Jesus is out dealing with the people. Socrates, basically sacrifices himself in the name of justice. So, I mean, would you just count that as a kind of prefiguration in some way?
Yeah, well, this touches pretty nicely on what we're going to talk about with Justin Martyr. Because Justin Martyr is going to deal with this problem of how the life of Jesus and the Christian theology that underlies the Trinity, his consubstantiality with the Father, the role of the Holy Spirit, he's going to have to answer for how many of these dimensions of Jesus' life, his being born of a virgin, his life, death, and resurrection, he's going to have to answer for how, at least according to the perceptions of the time, it seemed as though some of these teachings were mirrored in various either contemporary mythologies or mythologies of old. And so Justin will acknowledge, actually, that there are similarities and that there are that there is a degree of harmony there. But he's going to say that, well, the demons, the wicked demons, they had been aware, at least in a very limited sense. They were kind of able to sense what Christ was going to end up accomplishing. And so for that reason, they twisted the fullness of the truth to the extent that they could understand it. And as a result of that, you have these fragmented mythologies that, while they have some degree of harmony with the Christian story, nevertheless, in their distortions, are demonic in origin. And so that's what Justin Martyr is going to kind of say. I take a little bit of a different view myself from Justin. I think that I'm a little bit more optimistic about it. Obviously, today, I would say that it would be demonic to mistake one of these prefigurements for the fullness of truth. Nevertheless, I think that within the context of their own time, we can definitely see them as quasi-types. They're not full-on types as we would understand typology in the Old Testament, because there, at least as far as what I think, we're dealing with real divine revelation, divine inspiration, which is categorically different from any kind of truth that we can ascertain by reason, which is how the Platonic schools attained their truths about God. Nevertheless, God's providence is working throughout the entire cosmos, and I think that what you read in the Old Testament, you get this important guarantee that the fullness of God's revelation will be revealed to the Gentiles, that the Gentiles will be given the fullness of divine revelation, and that all of the Gentiles will have this opportunity to have intimacy with God, with the one God who did reveal himself in a very specific and special way to the Israelites. Nevertheless, because of his overarching plan of universalizing these divine promises, these divine mysteries, I think that he certainly, in his wisdom, would have patterned the fullness, or he would have ensured that there would be these extra Judaic prefigurements or types of the fullness of his revelation. And I think that we see that in things like the life of Socrates. We see that, I would actually argue, in at least in a more fragmented and shadowy way, in some of the Greek pagan mythologies. But I would say that's all fulfilled in the person of Jesus.
Sure, yeah. No, like for instance, Dionysus is a dying and resurrecting god, and in his mysteries, you consume, or at least somebody consumes, wheat and wine as a kind of like recollection of our participation in that divine
and of course, we
body.
do understand that, like, the bread and wine imagery is primarily coming from Melchizedek within the Jewish tradition. But I think that it's not a coincidence that this also has an echo in something like the mythology of Dionysius.
Right. I don't know whether there was necessarily consensus among the church fathers that it was demonic influence that accounted for these types. I think you're right, like that providence had to play a role, but I think there may be some church fathers, maybe like Clement of Alexandria potentially, or it might be Origen, who's considered heretical, but they suggest that actually you're dealing with like the angelic side of the spectrum, not the demonic, when you're talking about the pagan gods in some cases. And I don't see why that couldn't be the case,
I think that it can be considered the case, although I would say that as those pagan mythologies had been crafted by human beings, you do enter into a sort of maybe demonic corruption of the truth that those pagan deities were really trying to signify about the one God.
Yeah. I don't know, if I would say that all pagan mythology is authored by human beings. I do think that mythology generally is kind of an outflowing of the subconscious, and like human agency isn't really involved. Joseph Campbell, in his major work, The Masks of God, really distinguishes Abrahamic religion as the one like world mythology that really does have this trace of like intentional agential authorship, and of course they have a particular canon of scriptures and a written tradition, whereas most other systems of religion were oral and there was variation. But I mean, isn't it possible that God does reveal things to non-Jews even before the time of Christ? Maybe not the fullness of it, and maybe not the main line of what will become the one world religion that we're headed towards, but like, couldn't there be some forms of divine revelation?
I would distinguish it from I would say yes, in the sense that I also think that um, I also would think that a tree is divine revelation. Right?
Hmm.
God reveals himself through natural substances. Natural substances signify through their form, uh, in a limited way, what is infinite and super eminently present in the one God. And for that reason, I think all creation is divine revelation. I would distinguish it though from inspiration. Um, and in now we have to make a little bit of a distinction here. So I think that God can certainly reveal things to, say, non-Jews at that time, through private. We would call that private revelation, a form of private revelation. But as far as our reliance on that, um, I think that our certainty we can have in divine revelation is would be restricted to public revelation. And the public revelation would be as a result of God's intention to um, form a people for himself. And so I would say that God speaks to that body through inspiration as intended to manifest in public revelation. But I would say that we can't really know which of the uh, pre-Christian, non-Judaic uh, teachings were a result of private revelation. We have no way of knowing that, at least from my standpoint as a Christian. I would have no way of knowing that. But I think it is possible. It's certainly possible that God may have given some form of communication to some of these authors, to some of these writers, at least at certain points of their careers. Um, that I'm certainly willing to entertain that possibility. Although I would say that I don't think there's a possibility for us to know that.
Okay, yeah, that's a good distinction. So public inspiration, being that kind of prophetic message received, would be exclusive to the Jews before Christ, which, as a Catholic, I think you would probably have to believe to be consistent. I do think, like with Plato in particular, he wasn't purely a rationalist. I do think Plato
Right,
and
that's true.
Pythagoras before him like took themselves to be receiving revelations of a kind. I mean, Socrates, like in a dialogue like the Phaedrus, talks about the speeches that he's giving as being inspired
Hmm.
by the nymphs or by
Well,
the god of love. And
I
there are
think,
like some interesting parallels in
yeah,
Plato's myths and then biblical concepts. Like in particular, there's this myth from the Statesman about like the
yeah,
cycling of the world, where effectively you have, of course, there's Kronos and then there's Zeus. Kronos is prior to Zeus, and there's a Cronian age where Kronos reigns, and then there's a Zeusian age where Zeus reigns. And Plato says in that dialogue, or I guess the is it the Eleatic Stranger who says it? I think so. Says that the Cronian age is like the golden age, and then the Zeusian age is when things are running down. So the universe is like a clock where you wind it up and then it runs down. That's not the parallel. The parallel is that when those ages shift, so you're in the Zeusian age and you go back to this golden age, the Cronian age, then the stars flip direction and the processes of life reverse. That's also not directly parallel. But one implication of that he goes into is that in this age, people are born as we have it today, but in that age, all of the dead rise, and so they're born out of the ground. So there is the
hmm,
idea in the Statesman of a future golden age, from our perspective, where the dead rise from the graves, which is pretty remarkable, really.
hmm,
That's
yeah,
centuries before.
yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One thing I would wonder though is what would be our, if I were to entertain this, what would be our uh, epistemological route to recognizing it as divine revelation? Because clearly, um, So either you would have to be committed to the notion that like the entire Platonic corpus is inerrant by virtue of being a result of divine inspiration, or you would have to be committed to the notion that Plato was inspired by God at certain moments of his life, but not in all moments of his life, so that his writings might contain some divine revelation and some purely human wisdom. How would you go about recognizing or identifying or distinguishing wheat from the chaff um, within the Platonic corpus? Whereas for us, we can kind of just recognize that okay, we have good reasons for believing in the divinity of Jesus, and if we believe the divinity of Jesus, we trust that he has, we have faith that he has entrusted his authority to the church. The church tells us what is public revelation, what is not. So it seems to me there's an epistemological problem with that would prevent us from identifying which of Plato's words or which of uh, Pythagoras's words are divine revelation and which are human wisdom. That would seem to be very significant. That would seem to be very spiritually important for us to be able to do, right?
Well, sure, yeah. And I wouldn't say that Plato was proto-Gnostic in the sense that the Christian early Gnostics were Gnostic, in that they thought like
Uh-huh.
there was a certain type of soul that was set apart. I mean, I say that, but even in Plato, there is the idea that like certain people are born with a capacity for philosophical insight, and you'll have to
Mm-hmm.
wait for the next time around, of course, with his concept of reincarnation, to
Right.
potentially lead one of those lives next time. But like, yeah, Plotinus argues against the Gnostics. You know, I think for Plato and for the Neoplatonists, the world is a good place, not an evil place. All that being said, though, there is a kind of Gnosticism in the Platonic tradition that just says, like, we have these faculties, not only rational faculties, but the faculties that receive divine inspiration in us. And so, just as, like, I can validate that 4 plus 4 equals 8 by calculating in my mind,
Right.
I can, validate the received inspiration of previous thinkers and mystics and whatnot by cross-referencing
Mm.
that those faculties in myself.
So you just have to have it, in other words.
Yeah, you would have to like get your achieve the same sort of intuitive wisdom that Plato himself got to. And that's really how the Neoplatonists thought about it. Like their curriculum was designed to guide the student up to that kind of intuitive ability. So you move from discursive reasoning up to the kind of low level
Right.
of intuition, up to the higher intuition where you like see beauty itself, you see these forms, and then you can validate Plato's
Mm.
myths and like what he's getting at.
Now that
Not that
is,
the myths are considered,
yeah.
literally true,
Now
but
that very sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Uh, were you want to continue?
no, you go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, well that very beautifully, I think, is inversely reflected to a certain degree in the Catholic spiritual tradition. However, arrived at from a very different vantage point, where we would say that like the ladder of divine ascent begins with um, purgation. So it begins with the purifying of our attachment to uh, carnal desires, to being detached from being weighed down to corporeity.
I would say that's in
And then,
Platonism as well.
right,
Definitely.
yeah.
Yeah.
The difference will be made apparent in a second.
Okay.
And then that reaches into the illuminative way, which I think it would kind of mirror the discursive reasoning stage. But then, once you get past the illuminative way, you enter the unitive way, which is the gift of contemplation, which is non-discursive union with the divine. Now, of course, in our tradition, very few people attain that in this life. Like
Yeah, that sounds just
there's,
like the ladder of virtues of the Neoplatonists. I mean,
but I think what's fundamentally different would be the approach, like the means whereby that's attained. Whereas I think we have this strong emphasis on unmerited grace. Like it's purely a matter of God's supernatural grace that he gives out of a superabundance of his generosity, and we merely cooperate with it. Whereas it seems, and you definitely correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not an expert on Platonism. That's you. Um, it seems to me that in the Platonic tradition, um, while it's true that you seem to be saying that you have to be given this faculty, it doesn't seem to map perfectly onto the concept of grace. In other words, there does seem to be more. Attaining that seems to stem more from within our own activity than it does for the Christian.
Right, and I see how it could definitely seem that way, but I think think about Socratic doubt, and he doesn't believe that he possesses any knowledge. Many of the most
Right.
fundamental insights in the dialogues are given in these myths that either Socrates had a dream and this was revealed to him, or he heard it from somebody and the source is ambiguous, or
Right.
like the key insight about love from the symposium is given by this Diotima figure who may have been fictional. So it's like he treats the most important kinds of knowledge as a kind of revelation to be received. Even like later Neoplatonists like Proclus will make a point of the fact that like ascent does not happen by building yourself up. Ascent happens by suspension from superior forces. Like the good of any particular soul will be found in kind of retracing the steps of its descent to its current place. So our good is in our source, and to get back to our source, there is a suspending energy that draws us up. It's not that there is a kind of willful, voluntary purgation that you have to perform. You have to turn your mind in that way. But I think this idea of like there is a divine energy that descends and inspires these higher faculties in us. It's certainly present. I mean, they had a more elitist view of it, but even in the Christian tradition,
Right.
as you're saying, like we only accept that a certain number of figures are genuine mystics within Christianity. So while the salvation is universal, and that's not as easy to see in Platonism,
Right. Certainly not.
yeah. Uh, Nevertheless, though, there is this like there's a spiritual kind of elite that does have access potentially to a higher form of revealed intuitive knowledge in some sense. Not the same as the Gnostic claim,
Yeah.
but in some ways
I
similar
wonder
to it.
if if the Platonic school, like the pre-Christian Platonic school, would have recognized or would have been able to identify the reality of the Incarnation, if that would have more universalized um, their conception of the availability of reaching the heights of the divine ascent. See, that seems to make the difference, where it's the incarnation, it's the condescension of divine presence into a human nature that's able to guarantee the possibility of salvation for everyone, even as even while um, the actual attainment of the gift of contemplation in this life is relegated to the kind of proportion that is more mirrored in the Platonic tradition.
Yeah, I actually think that's kind of a defect in the Neoplatonic worldview. I mean, they do accept that there are higher souls who incarnate here
Yeah.
effectively to help humanity, but there's not a similar doctrine to like the divine incarnation. The gods themselves can't condescend to take up mortal
Hmm.
bodies. But interestingly, in the Pythagorean tradition, I mean, there are versions of the life of Pythagoras that basically explicitly claim him to be an incarnation of Apollo, contradicting that later Neoplatonic view. But
Mm.
really, I think that a lot of this tradition doesn't really even originate in Greece. My view is that it originates with the Upanishadic philosophy in India. The Upanishads are written in dialogue form. I think they get at many of the ethical contents of Platonism and some of the metaphysical contents, although they don't have a developed theory of the forms, but they have like the tripartite soul. They have many elements of Platonism fleshed out centuries before Plato. So, but if that's the case, that's interesting because the Hindus, of course, do have the idea of divine incarnation in their concept of the avatar. So it seemed like, to me, Neoplatonism has this like Christ-sized hole in it that, you know, it would be perfect.
That's a wonderful way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it really would be perfect within their own system of theology to have this incarnation because, you know, you have appearances of the various henads. The henads are like the gods in their pantheons, but basically representing aspects of unity. But there is one chief henad, and there's one like most perfect aspect of unity, and that like, you know, God of all gods manifest here is just kind of left out. You know, we can have appearances of different aspects, like the Zeus aspect of God can be worshipped in this way, and the wisdom of Athena in this other way. And yeah, Zeus has like a priority over the other gods, but in Neoplatonic theology, like late Neoplatonic theology, Zeus isn't really even a central figure in a certain sense. Like they have these other higher gods, like Kronos is higher in a sense than Zeus, or they come up with new gods like Phanes, who's even higher than Kronos, and there's a whole set of them, but like there's not the idea that like the one in its like most faithful representation appears to us in a particular form.
Yeah.
There is the idea that particular manifestations of the gods are suited to their characters and take on like historically specific, geographically specific identities. Just extrapolate that to the whole world, and sure, there should be like the manifestation of the one in a fundamental sense on Earth in one place, right?
What I find fascinating is that many of the church fathers will, in trying to give or provide a metaphysical framework within which to understand the incarnation. And this, like I said, this isn't the fathers, but I think it's more refined in the later medieval traditions. They point to a conspicuously Neoplatonic concept to draw that out, to draw out like the metaphysical framework within which to understand the logic of the incarnation. And that would be the concept of the good as self-diffusive. I'm sure you're very familiar with that concept. The Suda Dionysius, it's all over the Suda Dionysius. It's, like I said, I think more refined in the later medieval traditions that really pick up on this idea. But I find it interesting that they are drawing from like I said, a conspicuously Neoplatonic idea in order to provide a framework for the one doctrine that, as we kind of been saying, is missing in Neoplatonic school. I was wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, that really can't be denied that late antique Christianity from Pseudo-Dionysius onward, but even with Augustine, I mean, even earlier, I mean, yeah, we're going to get into this in the whole series of readings, just how much the Church Fathers
I'm sorry, we haven't gone
on.
too deeply into the Fathers, and we're already an hour in, but...
No, that's fine. This should be like a general kind of overview of the problems and what we're on the lookout for, and then we'll dive into the specific texts as we go on here. But yeah, no, I mean, I think it's really evident, and it's curious. Let's trace this back, I guess, briefly to like where it gets kicked off. So there's Ammonius Saccas, who is potentially one or two historical individuals. Either there was a Christian Ammonius Saccas and a Neoplatonic Ammonius Saccas, or they were one and the same person, and this individual converted one way or the other during the course of their life. So there are some like Christian texts that are attributed to Ammonius Saccus, I don't know which church fathers attribute these to him, but he is cited by church fathers as a Christian, and of course he's cited in the Neoplatonic tradition as a Neoplatonist. So, and he's the teacher of Plotinus as well as Origen. And Origen, there are potentially two Origins. One, the Christian Origen, and the other, the Neoplatonic Origen, that is mentioned by Porphyry in his biography of Plotinus. And in where he's brought up, it said that Plotinus was lecturing on a topic, and Origen walked in, and Plotinus like felt shame to like, I don't know, have the gall to speak in front of someone he respected as much as he respected Origen. So that says a lot about, how, if this was one and the same individual, how influential Origen may have been on Neoplatonic thought, inspired by Neoplatonism, taught by a Neoplatonist. But this is really where the traditions, I think, become very difficult to pull apart. Already Justin Martyr, I guess that's around the time of Ammonius Saccus, but Justin Martyr makes reference to Plato. He writes dialogues in a fairly Platonic style, or at least one surviving. Yeah. And says very explicitly that Platonism is the best of the philosophical schools, and it was that kind of segued him into Christianity. But yeah, with this Ammonius Saccus, Origen, and on, there's a lot of ambiguity as to what's really going on there, I think, historically. And in the later tradition especially, it gets even murkier, where the Byzantine Empire absorbs the Platonic schools, that kind of ascent of virtue up to the mystic experience of Godhead that you described really did remind me of the latter virtues from Neoplatonism. And that's not surprising, since the Platonic schools, which the Byzantine Empire assimilated wholesale, they adopted these schools, basically forced the teachers in them to convert to Christianity if they weren't already Christian, and then took the schools were using that exact, that was their model of the curriculum, this ascent of the virtues. But Pseudo-Dionysius, I have read not all of Proclus yet, but I've read enough Proclus to identify that there is pretty clear, I would call it plagiarism by the Pseudo-Dionysius. The sequence of arguments in On the Divine Names relating to the the Greek term is hypostasis, or parasitical is one English translation, but the parasitical quality of evil, and at the same time the privatory nature of evil. It's kind of a complex view that is really first fleshed out in the philosophical tradition by Proclus in his essay on the nature of evil, or something, I forget the exact title, but he gives exactly Proclus's series of arguments and a lot of Proclus's technical vocabulary. So when I read the Mystic Theology, it's hard for me not to think this is literally top to bottom Proclus's metaphysics plus the Trinity. And exactly where the Trinity fits in for Pseudo-Dionysius is ambiguous, in my opinion. I think it's hard to read precisely what that means and how that equates to concepts in Proclus. But yeah, I think there's definite ongoing interaction between the Neoplatonists and the Christians, and I would chalk that up to Christianity didn't come with a philosophical interpretation. Jesus didn't teach a philosophical doctrine per se, and exactly. So what were they going to draw on? If Platonism is in fact the true philosophy in just philosophical terms, well then the true religion would have to draw on the true philosophy. They couldn't look anywhere else for it. And also, if you just look and survey what other philosophical traditions could they have drawn upon, none of them is really as compatible, I think, with the ethics of Christianity as Platonism. Aristotle does not emphasize asceticism nearly as much as Plato does. Aristotle doesn't seem to believe in the immortality of the soul. Plato clearly does. Plato has very clear ideas of rewards and punishment after death. Plato even has the idea of the daimon, and of course in Christianity we have the guardian angel that plays basically the
And
exact
Justin
same.
Martyr makes these points too. So.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
They just would have been self-evident. Now, in like a cynical kind of mode of interpretation, we can say there are these parallels because the Hebrew Bible was inspired partly by Platonic ideas, and then like Jesus learned from Philo, who was himself inspired by Platonism, and so that's why there are these parallels. They just took it from the Platonists, or like we can look at this as like there is one truth. God is not necessarily going to save the one truth only for his historical incarnation. Very possibly he allows human beings access to it through our natural faculties and through some forms of limited inspiration, maybe not the same exact kind of inspiration as the Hebrew prophets, but I think there are good ways of justifying the connection either way. The one thing that I find difficult to justify, though, is the idea that they continued to take from like recalcitrant Neoplatonic pagans like Proclus. Like Proclus, I don't think Proclus writes against Christianity, but he's like one of the later holdouts in terms of like the Greeks of his time. And then the idea that they take up these academies kind of wholesale, they bring them into this Christian tradition. Like they're continuing to take material. It's not just that they like picked up the pieces of the old Platonism. It's like meanwhile pagan Platonists are doing more philosophical work, and it seems to me that in a certain way the Christians just continue to kind of absorb it, even though it's from a pagan source. So that's kind of confusing to me, and this is one of the prime reasons that I want to do the reading is like, well, maybe it's more of a back and forth dialectic than I understand, with a character like Ammoniusakis or Origen. Maybe Neoplatonism itself has in a certain regard Christian origins. It's very difficult.
It might not be like just one absolute origin from another. It could, like you said, and this is why I want to continue the study as well. Because they're not writing in, they're not always writing in like isolated parts of the world, like, so there's going to be some cross pollination here. Similarly, well, what I would also say though is I think that you end up with a little bit more of a refined independence of Christian thought in the later traditions. So like up and through the Scholastic periods. So I hope that our investigation of this can also touch on how the Scholastic era is sort of able to survey the preceding accumulation of wisdom, be it Christian or Neoplatonic or both, and see how that had sort of brought about a new synthesis. So like in people like Aquinas and Bonaventure and John Scotus Erigena and others.
Right. Yeah, no, and there are definitely developments that happen in Scholasticism. It's I've read some of the very latest pagan Neoplatonist authors like Damascius, Olympiodorus, and Simplicius, and you do see like the beginnings of the Scholastic style, not so much in Damascius, and not totally in Olympiodorus, but with Simplicius specifically. Like reading him, I was reminded of like the literary style that you see in Thomas Aquinas. So like there really is a line of continuity between these late antique Platonic schools in Alexandria and in Athens, the two main schools, and then the Scholastic tradition, which it's not exactly a copy paste from the pagan schools onto it, but there is real historical continuity. And of course, as they dropped the paganism, they assimilated this Neoplatonic framework in the name of an Aristotelianism, interestingly, in many cases. onto the Christian like language, Christian religion explicitly. But yeah, the way that the schools operated, really the history of like our university system, which we still have, in a certain way, I think actually does trace back to those Platonic schools in Athens and Alexandria. Like the early church clearly had its schools. The catechetical schools were a major part of how the early church was organized. But in the beginning...
That's where we get most of our patristic wisdom, is from these catechetical orations.
Right. But in the beginning, what catechetes had to go through was primarily like ethical. So you learned what was expected of you as a Christian. Clearly, they didn't like expand that much on theological notions, because in the first 2 centuries, the theology simply wasn't developed. It's not even obvious that like it was Trinitarian until the end of the 2nd century, across the board. Like the kind of earlier Logos Christology. I've been reading this book, which I would recommend to people, James Papandrea, Reading the Church Fathers. It's just a history of the Church Fathers, pretty much, but he characterizes it as like a Logos Christology that Tertullian has. I think even Justin Martyr, he says, has this kind of concept, which it sounds very similar to the concept that Philo had of like the Logos of God. So applied to Christ, the Logos of God, there's the word in God's mind, and then that's the Son, who's independent in some sense, although even some of the, quote unquote Orthodox church fathers seem to blend into almost a kind of modalism, which is this position where like the different persons of the Trinity are different modes of activity of the one God. So at one point in time, you can call God Jesus because that's when he's manifesting as that expressed Logos. At another point in time, he's the Father because he's kind of unexpressed or whatnot. But there's really not like theological consensus in a deep way until the 3rd century and even before, like just before the Council of Nicaea. A lot of things are not quite pinned down,
I think that you're certainly right about that, in the sense that the precise terminology and philosophical categories that were used to explicate the Trinity in the Orthodox fashion were definitely less precise, and therefore may appear to lend themselves toward this or that Trinitarian heresy at that time. I think it's not until you start to get language about subsisting relations of opposition, procession, hypostases. It's not until you get that language more developed and greater precision that I think what you do end up seeing is not so much a discontinuity between how the apostolic and ante-Nicene fathers spoke about the Trinity, but I think you get a more fully fleshed out development of what was already there implicitly.
Right, and I don't know to the extent that how much like creative exegesis we have to do of the earlier church fathers to justify that, but there is definitely that developmental approach, and that's kind of the way that doctrine is seen to develop within the church, that like the later developments can't contradict earlier sayings, but also at the same time, like none of the church fathers were infallible, and so if you have
so it certainly can contradict some of them,
right,
for sure.
Exactly. So like it's hard to trace the development of a doctrine like the Trinity in the 2nd century. It's just really hard to find like an explicitly orthodox presentation of it. But yeah, you can see the seeds of it. But that being said, I'm kind of interested in that kind of Logos Christology, and this view like of the Logos in God's mind, and then the Logos that's spoken, because that's a very like philosophical dichotomy. Like there is the Logos that is the concept, the idea in our mind that's there to be tapped into, and then there's the expressed logos. And so then like that's a very natural way of interpreting the incarnation, and it's also consistent with Philo's idea of the logos. And in fact, Philo does call the logos at one point the Son of God, which is pretty cool, I think. But
well, yeah, and I think we can also tie this to how the logos is related to the wisdom of the Old Testament. Because I think that was very much consciously on Philo's mind about what is the wisdom spoken about in the Old Testament. There's seems to be some indications that it refers to the wisdom as created, but yet also before all ages. I think there's a way to do that, like philosophically and theologically, but it is, I think, we can't overlook the importance of the wisdom of the Old Testament in Philo's discussion of the logos. So I don't think we shouldn't get into the mindset that it's all from Platonism, because the Old Testament itself lends very much to this language about the logos through the wisdom literature.
Numenius of Apamea, who I mentioned before, Neo-Pythagorean, sometimes called the father of Neoplatonism, he explicitly identifies the Hebrews as one of these groups that like received the same archaic divine like monotheistic doctrine. So one way of interpreting what the Neoplatonists are saying, like, yeah, they're polytheists in a certain regard, but what they're talking about is gods. Like Olympiodorus even says explicitly to his Christian students in Alexandria, like, you can just think of the gods as like either angels or different aspects that are manifesting.
Or the ideas.
Yeah, I mean, he would probably distinguish between the ideas and the gods. The gods are like a higher order thing than the forms. They're kind of like the nascent differentiations that manifest at a lower level in the forms, because the forms are intelligible and the gods are super intelligible. Right. So, but yeah, I mean, he does say to his Christian audience, think of them as different manifestations, different aspects of the one God. And Proclus says that like the one is God simply, not just the first God, but God simply. So there is a kind of like deeper monotheism. I think that was probably there even in the Eleusinian mysteries. I think that is there potentially in the Egyptian tradition, although I'm not as well versed in it. But yeah, Numenius at least believed that the Egyptians, the Chaldeans, the Greeks, and the Hebrews were among those traditions that shared this kind of concept of the one God. So that, I mean, that's whether that's because the Hebrew Bible already had influences from other sources, or because, like, there is one truth, one monotheistic truth about the nature of divinity that expresses itself differently in different cultures, or what the exact reason is. Like, there's testimony to that effect, not only within the Jewish interpretive tradition in a character like Philo, but also in Neo-Pythagoreanism and even in later Neoplatonism. Like, they were very much comparative mythologists, and they didn't just refer to Platonic sources. They also referred to the Chaldean oracles and the Orphic hymns, and they even interpreted Homer in terms of their theology that they developed in terms of this like higher occult monotheism and the same kind of ethics that they extract, very consistent with Christian ethics, from the dialogues and elsewhere. So, I mean, it's something that we really just need more time living with the thought of the Church Fathers to really suss out, like, how deep is this connection there. But that's why we're doing this, and so I'm looking forward to it. I don't know if we want to read like literally every document from the Church Fathers. I might kind of preview myself and see if there's something that we should go into. I mean, what's your take on it? Do you think like an exhaustive...
I think we should maybe go a little bit chronologically.
Yeah.
I feel like we should start with the Apostolic Fathers.
Sure. Like, as in reading from the New Testament?
No, I mean like Clement of Rome, the Shepherd of Hermas, Ignatius of Antioch.
Oh,
Um,
okay. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So you have the Apostolic Fathers. Um, you have which are like late for uh, mainly like second century, mainly second
Right.
century figures. Polycarp as well.
Right,
Um,
right.
yeah, yeah. So maybe we should start with them because then we can really get a nice chronological uh, sense of how the thought of the fathers develop, and then as they develop into the late second and third century, there's a lot more explicit and intentional engagement with Platonism, and we can
Right.
kind of see how that, and also from the thought of Irenaeus of Lyon as well. He's uh, very important. He's probably one of the earliest uh, engage Christian engagements with Platonic thought. So I think we should really start just to study Clement of Rome, Irenaeus of Lyon, Polycarp, Ignatius of Alexandria. There's a wonderful collection of their writings. Let me grab it in case you wanted to get it for yourself.
Yeah, I think the link that I sent you for Justin Martyr is from that collection. So that site has all the church fathers. And that's kind of what I want to do. I would like to go through
Yeah,
exhaustively, beginning with Clement of Rome. And some of his documents are even earlier than, like, the book of Revelation, I believe. Typically, it's considered to be.
depending on
Um,
how you date it. But
right, yeah. I've heard, like, 60
yeah,
AD or so for him.
so
And,
the book that, oh, sorry, go
mhm.
ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah, so the book that I have is kind of an anthology of sorts by Michael W. Holmes called The Apostolic Fathers, Greek text and English translations, third edition. So obviously, I'm not like gonna ask you to buy this book. You have all of it online, but just to give you a sense of who's included and who probably should be included in our initial investigations, we could start with the Clementine epistles. We
Hmm.
could get That'll take us to Ignatius of Antioch, uh, Polycarp. We'd read the Martyrdom of Polycarp, the Epistle of Barnabas, um, the Didache. I don't know if you want to read the Didache because that's not really from a father, but it is important literature. Then you have the Shepherd of Hermas. I mean, I can communicate all this to you in writing as well, but
Sure. No, I
I
think
think
we
it
should
is
do it
really
all.
important for us to start with them because these are the ones who were given the deposit of faith from the apostles most directly. They have the direct line from that original primordial apostolic witness. And then we can see how their thought is able to develop and continue on through the ante-Nicene fathers and the post-Nicene fathers, and how you have this deposit of faith interact with the wider intellectual culture of the day, specifically and primarily through its engagement with Platonism.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, I would love to do all of that. I think we should be exhaustive with it. And so, everybody, if you have not already read the New Testament, I would say that's the required
Yeah, you want
reading
to
to
start
get
with,
done
yeah, yeah.
before any of this. But you have until August 4th to catch up with that. That should be plenty of time. And then we will be reading these off of whatever public domain version is available freely online. I think I already have one pulled up, so
Hmm.
that'll be like displayed on the screen. But yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
So,
Anyone is welcome
question.
to roundtable together for these because we want a lot of perspectives, and I'm sure people out there are maybe even more knowledgeable than either of us on all of this church fathers stuff. So
So question though. Is your idea to just primarily talk about how it engages with Platonism, or do you want to kind of just let the writings speak for themselves,
no, we should
and then
definitely
we
engage
can,
with them on their own terms.
yeah, that's
It's
what I'm thinking. Yeah.
it's just kind of the broader, I think, blind spot that many people have today is
Hmm.
like the relation of Platonism and Christianity, because I think in a certain sense, like if you're a Orthodox Christian, like in some ways you're a Platonist, whether you like it or not, you know. And I think that connection is not like deeply understood enough. So no, I think we should read them on their own terms and understand exactly what the church fathers were thinking and what the church was thinking. But yeah, it's just kind of an interesting mystery, you know, exactly how it all weaves together. Before we end, I just like, for my own curiosity of your views, because I know that you do appreciate Pseudo-Dionysius, what do you make of that, like him taking so much from Proclus? Because I don't know exactly what to think about it. I really do think the evidence is strong that he is taking pretty much whole passages and sequences of arguments and technical vocabulary and a huge amount from Proclus specifically. So, like, do you think that that's fair? I don't know how much you've read Proclus yourself to evaluate that, but, like, do you think that can be defended? And, you know, taking from a pagan near contemporary is, like, acceptable? And then also the idea of the pseudonymous authorship, because I think some of the early church fathers were very explicitly against pseudonymous authorship, and they used that.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. So yeah,
well,
what do you think about
the reason he has so much authority in the church, historically, was because they thought of him as a disciple of Paul. And for that reason, like if you're dealing with someone who you perceive to be a disciple of Paul, you're gonna treat this guy like almost as if you would treat Scripture. Because of that perceived proximity there. There are still people to this day, by the way, who defend, like, who refute or attempt to refute or repudiate the claim that he's not authentic. I'm not one of them. I think he's probably like a 5th century bishop writer. But as far as his relationship to Proclus, that is something I myself would want to investigate further. I've not fully delved into Proclus. I've read Dionysius himself. I'll just call him Dionysius. I don't like saying pseudo all the time. I've read Dionysius myself, and so I'd have to see exactly how Proclus is echoed in the Dionysian corpus. In theory, I have really no problems with it. I think that it's not. Are you suggesting that it's sort of reflective of an underlying malice to do that? Because I think that this is a time when there's not really a jealously guarded conception of intellectual property like we have today. So
no, yeah, I wouldn't interpret it as malicious. If anything, I would interpret it as this is somebody who really highly esteems these concepts and wants to assimilate them into their faith. And I think, you know, whoever the author of those writings was, he was a person of genuine faith. But it's just kind of curious because the early church fathers were very against pseudonymous writing, and it's almost like, I don't know if this is a wink and a nod at some of his contemporaries, because, like, you know, these guys were probably aware of Proclus's writings. He wasn't like a low profile figure by any means, and he even Pseudo-Dionysius references his teacher, who he calls Hierotheus, and there's no, like, so he doesn't refer to his teacher as Paul explicitly in his own writings. He kind of invents this literary figure, Hierotheus, and says that Hierotheus wrote this eminent kind of theological tract, The Elements of Divinity. And of course, what is Proclus's most famous philosophical tract? Elements of Theology, or Elements of Metaphysics, alternatively translated. So he's definitely like dropping some hints, and the borrowing is very. If you read Proclus on the existence of evils, and then Dionysius on the divine names, I think you can very easily identify, like, there's a set of arguments, a sequence of arguments that are the same in both documents, and of course the one author
Yeah.
is
Now,
later. So
what I would say is that, when you read Dionysius, he is very adamant about the he is very adamant about not speculating about divine things in ways that are not ultimately rooted in the sacred oracles, namely sacred scripture.
mm-hmm.
He's very he writes very many, I should say, cautionary notes at the beginning of his work that you have to avoid speculation about the divine that is outside, either implicitly or explicitly, outside the realm of what has been given to us in the divine oracles, in the scriptures. So while I'm certainly open to the possibility that he's using Proclus's writings as sort of a springboard for his own theology, I think that we should also read Dionysius as thoroughly Christian nonetheless. So he may be using Proclus as a springboard, but it would be a springboard for explicating Christian truths contained in the scriptures.
Right.
So it'd be used at the service of that, because he's very passionate. He's very adamant about staying within the bounds of sacred scripture and Christian divine revelation.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, there are even Platonic arguments for maintaining that attitude, especially among, like,
I'm sure,
the
yeah,
masses.
I can see
it.
Like,
there's the idea, like, most people need to simply believe what is given, because most people are not philosophers, and they're not going to be able to discern the truth of these things. And if, like, widespread speculation is just encouraged, then society's not going to be coherent, first of all, and the odds that we're just going to converge on the truth are very low. But I think basically, like, I read Proclus and appreciate him as one of the greatest philosophers of all time in his own right, even though primarily he's commenting on Plato and, really falling in line firmly with his teacher Syrianus and the whole Iamblichian branch of Neoplatonism. But, like, as a Christian reading him, I think, like, you were so close. Why couldn't you kind of make that leap that there should be this one incarnation of, like, the highest aspect of divinity? And, like, it seems like it should be so close. But I think it's a general problem where, Christians emphasizing the revealed aspects, the faith aspect of our relation to God, would necessarily downplay philosophy. And so what are the odds that, like, the best philosophical arguments are going to come out of the Christians during especially those centuries when the Platonic schools are still around? I mean, meanwhile, you have these people who maybe don't pick up on that aspect that can only maybe be revealed and not, attained rationally or mystically or otherwise. And, like, they'll probably be able to come up with better arguments, but maybe they won't converge quite on the truth. So maybe these are, like, two halves in a way. Like, one emphasizes perfecting human reason and perfecting our epistemological faculties, and then the other emphasizes the importance of revelation. And, like, the only way to get the ideal theologian would it kind of paradoxically be to have a figure like Pseudo Dionysius, taking what is true, which is, I think, a lot of it, from Proclus, and then just adding that extra step that Proclus himself with his methods couldn't quite take.
And perhaps. I think that gets refined even further in the Scholastic tradition, where I think you have that brings about the synthesis, in my opinion. Another thing I'll say about Dionysius is that, and St. Thomas makes this remark this remark as well when he comments on Dionysius, is that the way that he writes, the way that he makes use of a lot of Platonic language in just how he writes, some of that is at the service of an ethical principle, which St. Thomas says is derived from what Jesus says, which is to not to cast pearls before swine, and for that reason, the truths that are contained in the Dionysian corpus are, at least the argument is made that these are deliberately obfuscated with more obscure, difficult to grasp, or difficult to immediately and straightforwardly intuit Platonic language. And maybe part of the reason, at least, for why he relies so heavily on Proclean modes of expression is partially for that reason.
Yeah, definitely, and that's another instance of kind of convergence of Platonic principles and Christian principles. You know, Jesus teaches in parables. Sometimes he says so that the many will not understand. You know, which is very Platonic in its own way. So I'm looking forward to digging into all of this much more deeply. I mean, we could go on probably indefinitely. There's a lot of writings. Today and also, but like what we're intending on doing, going through the Church Fathers. So I'm perfectly willing to commit to that every other Friday. Again, beginning August 4th. Read the New Testament. In the meantime, it never hurts to read the Bible, in my opinion. So yeah, refresh yourself on that. And then we'll be starting on one of the epistles of Clement, August 4th. And we're going to do, I think we already said, but that'll be 5 p.m. Central Time, 6 p.m. Eastern. So if anyone wants to be in the round table for that, just email me. Otherwise, show up for the live stream, share your thoughts in the live chat, and we'll try to answer questions and engage with the audience, because this is something that we could all benefit from, I think. And yeah, thank you very much for the discussion today, Classical Theists. It was a lot of fun. And we'll talk again soon.
All right, God bless you.
God bless you.